This is how to actually make your videos look and feel cinematic. We're going to talk about 5 things here. It's going to be gear, camera settings, lighting, audio, and composition. So the first thing is gear. Despite what people tell you, gear does matter. To make your videos look cinematic, you have to have the right gear. This includes having a camera with an interchangeable lens. It just means you can take your lens off and put a different one on. You'll also need a camera that can shoot in 4K and one that can shoot 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second. Now, these things are important because if you're shooting in 4K, you can get the most detail and the crispiest type of image. The other nice thing about shooting in 4K is if you need to crop in for anything, you can still export your clip at 1080p and have a very nice, clean image. Now, shooting in 24 frames per second is important because that's what you'll see movies and TV shows are actually shot in. And so with shooting in 24 frames per second, that's the most lifelike, the most normal motion blur that resembles real life and resembles what you'll see on TV. Shooting in 60 frames per second allows you to then slow that footage down in post-production if you want to shoot anything in slow motion. With these settings, you'll want to make sure that your camera has the capability of going into manual mode so that you have full control over your frames per second, over your shutter speed, and over your ISO. Now, let me know if you want me to make a video going deeper into these 3 things, but I'll touch on them briefly. We've talked about your frames per second already. Now we'll talk about the shutter speed. Now for the shutter speed, your shutter speed needs to be double your frame rate. And what I mean by this is if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, your shutter speed needs to be 1/48. Now, a lot of cameras can't shoot 1/48 for the shutter speed, so it'll need to be 1/50, which is the closest thing to being twice as much as your frame rate. Now, for your ISO, this is your camera's sensitivity to light. And so every camera has a native ISO. This is the ISO that your camera performs best at, that gives you the cleanest image. If you shoot outside of that ISO, you run the risk of your camera creating an image that has more noise in it. It looks grainy, but not the type of grain that you appreciate in a movie or on TV. This is more of like a TV static sort of noise. So I would just search online, look up your camera and look at the native ISO and try your best to shoot in that ISO. Now, if you try to shoot in that ISO when you're indoors and it is still not bright enough, this is where your lighting comes into play for a few reasons. Your lighting will allow you to get a bright, nice image on your subject. And there are a few different ways to light a subject. You might have heard of 3-point lighting, which involves a key light, which is the main light you can see on a subject's face. I'm using a key light right now that will shine right on this side of my face. There's also what's called a fill light. Once you shine a light on one side of your face, the other side becomes darker in contrast to one another. So a fill light helps to kind of fill in the darker side of your face so that the ratio between the two sides isn't as drastic. Now, you also have what's called a rim light or a hair light. This is a light that goes behind you that shines on the back of your hair or on the back of your shoulders, and this kind of pulls you out from the background of your image. You can also have what's called a practical light. So in this case, it's going to be the light bulb that's behind me. Not only does it look nice, but it also shines a little bit onto the backside of me too. So this is 3-point lighting. You'll typically see this in like an interview setting or a talking head shot like what you're seeing now. But to be honest, you don't need all 3 lights to make something look cinematic. In fact, a lot of the time I only use 1 light or I'll use a window or something like that. But very rarely am I ever using 3 different lights to light a scene. So that's your gear, that's your camera settings, and that's lighting. Now, when it comes to audio, if you want something to look cinematic, do not let the viewer see the microphone in the shot. It distracts the viewer, it takes them out of being immersed into the cinematic scene you're trying to film, and it just doesn't look good. So if I were you, I would avoid all costs of showing the mic in your shot. Now you're gonna see some vlogs and other videos where the mics are showing, like DJI mics or Rode mics, and those are more on the go type of videos that don't tend to be a cinematic sort of story. So there's kind of a purpose for those. But if you're trying to shoot a cinematic sequence, do not show the audio in your shot. The next thing we'll touch on is composition. So you may have heard of the rule of thirds, and that's basically where your shot is set up into 3 different sections. You're gonna have a top, a middle, and a bottom. And then you'll have a right side, a center, and a left side. And so you'll want to place your subject on one of the intersecting lines in order to get the most interesting shot. But also, a viewer tends to look at these intersections naturally. And so that's where you should place objects of interest or your subject. So I briefly touched on these, but if you want me to dive any deeper into these, please let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to make a video about each individual topic or whatever it is that you want to know more about. So thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.